Voroshilovgrad Sector, Southern Front, September 1943. The smell of burning canvas reached them before the news did. Yelena Vasilievna Kotova was elbow deep in the engine cowling of Po-2 number 17 when she heard the ground crew fall silent. That particular silence, the one that spread like oil across water, meant only one thing. She didn't look up. She already knew. "Sorokina and Belova," someone whispered. "They didn't come back." Yelena kept her hands moving inside the engine, fingers tracing the familiar geometry of spark plugs and fuel lines. If she stopped, she would have to acknowledge it. If she acknowledged it, she would have to feel it. And if she felt it, she would be useless for the rest of the night. 32 women remained in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. 3 weeks ago, there had been 40. Engels Airfield, 8 months earlier. She had not come here to fight. Yelena remembered the recruitment poster in Krasnodar, a woman's face framed by aviator goggles. The slogan beneath it promising glory and purpose. She had been 21 years old, a third-year chemistry student specializing in agricultural compounds, and utterly convinced that the war would be over before she finished her training. The war had other plans. At Engels, the instructors sorted the volunteers with brutal efficiency. The best pilots went to the 586th Fighter Regiment, where they would fly sleek Yak-1s against the Luftwaffe's finest. The second tier went to the 587th Bomber Regiment, handling the twin-engine Petlyakovs. And the rest, the ones who could barely keep a trainer level, the ones whose landing approaches resembled controlled crashes, they went to the 580th Night Bomber Regiment. Yelena had not been sorted into the 588th. She had requested it. "You're making a mistake," the assignment officer had said, eyebrows raised. "Your technical scores are excellent. You could be a navigator for the 587th. "I want to work with my hands," Yelena had replied. "I want to understand how things burn." The officer had stamped her transfer without further argument. The 588th needed mechanics more than it needed navigators. The regiment's aircraft, obsolete Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes designed in 1928 for crop dusting and training exercises, broke down with depressing regularity. Their wooden frames splintered, their canvas skins tore, their engines coughed and sputtered in the frozen night air, and when they caught fire, they burned like paper lanterns. Voroshilovgrad Sector, Southern Front, September 1943. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya stood before the assembled regiment, her face carved from exhaustion and something harder. Behind her, a map of the sector hung from a wooden frame, red pins marking German positions, blue pins marking their own. There were fewer blue pins than there had been last week. "The airfield at Voroshilovgrad," the major began, her voice flat and precise, "has become the primary operating base for Yagdgeshwader 52. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s are intercepting our missions before we reach our targets. In the past 3 weeks, we have lost 8 crews, 16 women." Silence filled the briefing tent. Yelena stood near the back, her hands still stained with engine grease, watching the faces of her comrades. Some stared at the floor, others gazed at the map as if willing the red pins to disappear. "Command has ordered us to neutralize the airfield," Bershanskaya continued. "We have attempted conventional bombing runs on 4 separate occasions. Each time their searchlights acquired our aircraft before we could glide into attack position. Each time their flak batteries—" She stopped. The words didn't need to be finished. Lieutenant Mikhail Sorokin, the regiment's chief engineer and one of only 3 men assigned to the unit, cleared his throat. He was a compact man with quick eyes and quicker judgments, technically brilliant and constitutionally incapable of hiding his contempt for what he called this circus of amateurs. "The fundamental problem," he said, stepping forward, "is payload capacity. A PO-2 carries a maximum of 350 kilograms of ordnance. Even with perfect accuracy, that is insufficient to destroy hardened hangars or reinforced aircraft shelters. We are throwing pebbles at a fortress." "Then we throw more pebbles," said Nadezhda Popova, the regiment's most experienced pilot. She sat in the front row, arms crossed, her jaws set at the angle that meant she was already calculating attack vectors in her head. "We fly more sorties. We hit them 8 times, 10 times, 12 times per night until something burns." And lose more crews in the process, Sorokin replied. The mathematics are simple. Each additional sortie increases our exposure to their defenses. At current attrition rates, the regiment will cease to be combat effective within 6 weeks. Then what do you suggest? Popova demanded. That we sit here and wait for the Germans to come to us? The argument continued, voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of frustration and fear. Yelena listened, but her attention had drifted to the map, specifically to the red pin marking the Voroshilovgrad airfield. She tried to picture it, the hangars, the fuel depots, the neat rows of gray fighters waiting for dawn. Her father had been a farmer in the Kuban region, not a wealthy one, but clever. When the collective couldn't afford proper equipment, he improvised. When the state-issued fertilizers proved too weak for the heavy black soil, he had experimented with his own mixtures: ammonium nitrate from the local chemical plant, waste oil from the tractor depot, careful balance of oxidizers and accelerants. She remembered the day he had demonstrated his technique for burning tree stumps. The commercial incendiaries were expensive and inefficient, dispersing their heat across too wide an area. Her father's paste, a thick, sticky compound that clung to surfaces and burned with patient, focused intensity, had reduced a century-old oak stump to ash in less than an hour. The problem isn't the bombs, Yelena murmured, too quietly for anyone to hear. The problem is the delivery. Later that night, the armory shed stood at the edge of the airfield, a low wooden structure filled with the regiment's modest arsenal. Fab 50 fragmentation bombs, Zab 50 incendiaries, and the small PTAB anti-tank bomblets that they occasionally carried for ground support missions. Yelena worked by candlelight, examining the standard incendiary charges. The Zab 50 was a competent weapon. Thermite core, magnesium casing designed to ignite on impact and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. But Sorokin was right. The Po-2's limited payload meant they could carry only 2, sometimes 3 of these devices per sortie. Against a dispersed target like an airfield, that simply wasn't enough. She picked up a spent ZAB casing, turning it over in her hands. The design was elegant but wasteful. Most of the incendiary material was consumed in the initial detonation, creating a brief but spectacular fireball that looked impressive but rarely spread beyond its immediate impact zone. What if the fire could be made to spread? Yelena set down the casing and pulled a small notebook from her pocket. The same notebook she had carried through 3 years of chemistry lectures at Krasnodar Agricultural Institute. She began to write, her pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. The fundamental chemistry was straightforward. Fire required fuel, oxygen, and heat. The standard incendiaries provided all 3 in a single violent moment. But her father's paste had worked differently. It burned slower, hotter, and longer. It clung to surfaces instead of splashing away. It created secondary fires that spread far beyond the initial point of ignition. The ingredients were simple: ammonium nitrate, which the regiment already used in some of its demolition charges; waste oil, which they had in abundance from their own aircraft maintenance; soap flakes, which acted as a binding agent and thickener. And the delivery system, that was the elegant part. Not a bomb casing with its complex fusing mechanisms and weight penalties. Just a simple bucket. A farmer's bucket, the kind her father had used to carry feed to the chickens. Light enough to hang from a wire beneath the Po-2's wing, simple enough to release with a pull of a cord. Yelena stared at her calculations, a strange electricity running through her chest. It was so obvious, so absurdly, embarrassingly obvious that someone must have already thought of it. She would take her idea to Lieutenant Sorokin in the morning. He was brilliant, everyone said so. He would know immediately if the concept was sound. And if it was... Yelena closed her notebook and extinguished the candle. Outside, the autumn wind carried the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere to the west, the Voroshilovgrad airfield slept peacefully, its Messerschmitts dreaming of tomorrow's kills. Not for much longer, she thought. Not if the chemistry was right. The engineering shed smelled of machine oil and cigarette smoke. Lieutenant Mikhail Sorokin sat behind a workbench cluttered with dismantled carburetors, his attention fixed on a technical manual that had been printed in Moscow before the war, back when paper was plentiful and Optimism was cheap. Yelena stood in the doorway, her notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times during the sleepless hours before dawn, running through her calculations, anticipating objections, preparing counter-arguments. Now, facing the reality of Sorokin's presence, his hunched shoulders, his perpetual frown, the way his eyes moved across the page with predatory focus, she felt her carefully constructed confidence begin to crack. "Lieutenant Sorokin," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He didn't look up. "The number 12 aircraft needs a new magneto. Check the supply manifest and file a requisition with the quartermaster's office." "I'm not here about the magneto, sir." Now he looked up. His gaze traveled from her grease-stained boots to her regulation cap. Pausing briefly at the notebook in her hands, something flickered in his expression. Not quite interest, but not quite dismissal either. "Kotova, isn't it? The chemistry student from Krasnodar." "Yes, sir." "You're competent with engines, better than most." He said this as if delivering a medical diagnosis rather than a compliment. "What do you want?" Yelena stepped forward and placed her notebook on the workbench, open to the page where she had sketched her design. The drawing showed a standard PO-2 biplane with 4 cylindrical objects suspended beneath its lower wings, simple buckets, rendered in precise cross-section, filled with a substance she had labeled Compound K. "I have an idea," she said, "about the Voroshilov-Grad problem." Sorokin's eyebrows rose a fraction of a millimeter. He pulled the notebook toward him, studying the sketch with the same intensity he had applied to his technical manual. For a long moment he said nothing. "Buckets," he finally said. The word hung in the air like an accusation. "Modified buckets, sir, reinforced with wire mesh to prevent premature rupture. The compound inside is an incendiary paste, ammonium nitrate base thickened with petroleum distillates and saponified fats. It adheres to surfaces on impact and burns at approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius for 8 to 12 minutes. You want to hang farmers' buckets from our aircraft and fill them with what, exactly? Homemade napalm?" "The chemical principle is similar, sir, but the delivery mechanism is entirely different. Standard incendiaries detonate on impact, creating a single point of ignition. This compound spreads on contact, creating multiple secondary fire sources across a much wider area. 4 buckets, properly distributed, could ignite an area equivalent to 6 or 7 conventional ZAB-50 bombs." Sorokin leaned back in his chair. The skepticism in his expression had hardened into something closer to amusement, the particular kind of amusement that preceded ridicule. "Let me understand this correctly," he said. "You propose that we attach metal containers filled with an unstable incendiary compound to the exterior of wood and canvas aircraft, fly those aircraft over enemy territory at low altitude, and then release those containers by hand, presumably using some kind of improvised mechanism that you haven't yet described, onto hardened military targets defended by radar-guided searchlights and automatic anti-aircraft batteries. The release mechanism would be a simple wire loop connected to a manual lever in the navigator's position. The buckets would separate cleanly at approximately 200 meters altitude, allowing time for the aircraft to clear the blast radius before... Before what?" Sorokin cut her off. "Before your little chemistry experiment detonates prematurely and incinerates the pilot? Before the wire loop fails and the bucket remains attached, turning the aircraft into a flying bomb? Before the incendiary paste leaks through your wire mesh reinforcement and ignites the fuel tank?" Yelena felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I've calculated the stability margins. The compound is inert until it reaches ignition temperature, which requires either friction or direct flame contact. In transit, the buckets would be no more dangerous than the standard ordnance we already carry. Standard ordnance that has been tested, approved, and manufactured by trained professionals in proper facilities." Sorokin stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Not mixed together in an armory shed by a chemistry student who should be focused on keeping our engines running instead of playing weapons designer. Sir, if you would just review the calculations." "I have reviewed enough." He pushed the notebook back toward her, not roughly, but with a finality that made her stomach drop. The answer is no. I will not authorize the use of experimental weapon systems that could endanger our pilots and compromise our already limited operational capacity. But the mathematics of your proposal are irrelevant if the practical implementation is unsound. And it is unsound, Comrade Kotova. Profoundly, dangerously unsound. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. Not with sympathy, but with something that might have been intended as kindness. You are young. You see a problem, and you want to solve it. That instinct is admirable, but this is not a university laboratory. This is war. And in war, untested ideas kill people. Yelena picked up her notebook. Her hands were steady, but something inside her had begun to tremble, a vibration of humiliation and frustration that threatened to escape through her eyes if she didn't leave immediately. "Thank you for your time, Lieutenant," she said. She was almost through the doorway when Sorokin called after her. "Kotova." She stopped but didn't turn around. "The number 12 Magneto, today, if possible." "Yes, sir." "The mess tent, that evening. The regiment ate in shifts, pilots and navigators first, then mechanics and ground crew. By the time Yelena arrived, the tables were mostly empty, the kettles of cabbage soup reduced to lukewarm dregs, the black bread sliced down to the heels that nobody wanted. She sat alone, as she usually did, spooning soup into her mouth without tasting it. Her notebook lay open beside her plate, the bucket diagram staring up at her like an accusation of failure. "May I sit?" Yelena looked up. Vera Antonova stood across the table, mess kit in hand, her navigator's insignia catching the lamplight. She was perhaps 5 years older than Yelena, with sharp cheekbones and sharper opinions, known throughout the regiment for her precise bombing calculations and her even more precise assessments of human character. Of course," Yelena said, closing her notebook. Vera settled onto the bench and began eating with methodical efficiency. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking up from her soup, Vera said, "I heard you approached Sorokin with some kind of proposal." Word traveled fast in the 5 and 88th. Too fast sometimes. "It was nothing," Yelena said. "A theoretical exercise. He was right to reject it." "Was he?" Vera's eyes met hers. Cool, appraising, missing nothing. "I've seen your work in the armory. You're not the type to waste time on theoretical exercises." Yelena hesitated. The humiliation of the morning was still fresh, a bruise she didn't want anyone to touch. But something in Vera's tone, not pity exactly, but a kind of professional curiosity, made her reach for the notebook. "It's an incendiary compound," she said, opening to the diagram. "Improvised delivery system. The idea was to increase our effective fire coverage without adding payload weight." Vera studied the sketch, her expression unreadable. "Buckets. Reinforced buckets, with a specialized combustion mixture. And Sorokin said no. He said it was dangerous, untested, unprofessional." Yelena heard the bitterness creeping into her voice and forced herself to stop. Vera was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "He's not wrong about the danger, but he's also not thinking about the alternative." She glanced toward the entrance of the mess tent, where a group of pilots had gathered, their laughter too loud, their movements too animated, the particular energy of people trying very hard not to think about death. "We lost Sorokina and Belova last night. Before that, it was Petrova and Mikhailova. Before that, Volkov and Grigorovich. The conventional approach is killing us, Kotova. Slowly, systematically, and with complete statistical predictability." "So what would you suggest?" Vera pushed the notebook back across the table. "I would suggest that some dangers are worth taking, but I'm not the one who needs to be convinced. Sorokin will never approve it. Sorokin is an engineer. His job is to keep machines running, not to win wars." Vera stood, gathering her mess kit. "There are people in this regiment whose job is to win wars. Perhaps you should consider speaking with one of them." She walked away, leaving Yelena alone with her cold soup and her diagram of buckets. Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the western sky in shades of blood and copper. In a few hours, the night missions would begin. More Po-2s would lift off into the darkness, their canvas wings humming, their crews praying to whatever god still listened. Some would return, some would not. The mathematics, as Sorokin had said, were simple, but mathematics could be changed, variables could be adjusted, equations could be rewritten. Yelena looked at her notebook one more time. Then she closed it, finished her soup, and went to find Major Bershanskaya. The major was reviewing reconnaissance photographs when Yelena requested permission to enter. The photographs showed the Voroshilovgrad airfield from above, blurred images captured by a high-altitude spotter plane, showing the layout of hangars, fuel storage tanks, and the distinctive silhouettes of parked aircraft. Comrade Kotova. Bershanskaya's voice carried the particular weariness of command, the weight of decisions that could not be unmade, the knowledge that every order she gave might send someone to their death. "You're not on the maintenance roster tonight? Is there a problem with one of the aircraft?" "No, Comrade Major. I wanted to speak with you about a tactical proposal." Something shifted in Bershanskaya's expression. Not quite hope, but a flicker of attention that hadn't been there before. "Close the tent flap," she said, "and show me what you have." The reconnaissance photographs lay spread across Major Bershanskaya's field table like a mosaic of failure. Yelena could see the annotations in red pencil, attack vectors that had been attempted, defensive positions that had been identified, the small X marks indicating where previous missions had encountered fatal resistance. There were many X marks. "Explain," Bershanskaya said. The word was neither invitation nor command, but something in between. The tone of a woman who had stopped believing in miracles, but hadn't quite stopped hoping for them. Yelena opened her notebook and placed it beside the photographs. Her hands, she noticed with distant surprise, had stopped trembling. Something about Bershanskaya's presence, her exhaustion, her directness, the complete absence of Sorokin's theatrical contempt, made the fear seem less important than the idea itself. "The conventional incendiaries we carry are designed for point targets," Yelena began. "A single building, a specific vehicle, a concentrated enemy position. But an airfield is a dispersed target. The hangars are separated by blast walls. The fuel storage is isolated from the maintenance areas. The aircraft themselves are parked in individual revetments designed to prevent fire from spreading." Bershanskaya nodded slowly. "This is why our bombing runs have been ineffective. Even when we hit something, the damage doesn't propagate." "Exactly, Comrade Major. The Germans have engineered their facilities to contain fires, not spread them. Our standard weapons play directly into their defensive design." Yelena pointed to the diagram in her notebook. "But what if we could create fires that don't stay contained? Fires that spread horizontally across surfaces, that cling to structures instead of burning out, that generate enough heat to ignite secondary material at a distance? You're describing something that doesn't exist in our arsenal." "It doesn't exist yet, but it could." Yelena took a breath. "The compound I'm proposing is based on agricultural chemistry, specifically the controlled burn techniques used by farmers in the Kuban region to clear stubborn vegetation. The base is ammonium nitrate, which we already have in our demolition supplies. Mixed with petroleum distillates and saponified fats, it creates a paste that burns at extremely high temperatures for extended periods. More importantly, it adheres to whatever surface it contacts. It doesn't splash away like liquid accelerants. It clings and it spreads." Bershanskaya studied the diagram for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "And the delivery mechanism, these buckets?" "Simple metal containers, reinforced with wire mesh to prevent fragmentation during release. 4 buckets per aircraft suspended beneath the lower wings on quick release hooks. The navigator activates the release manually using a cable system routed to the rear cockpit. At 200 meters altitude, the buckets separate, fall freely, and rupture on impact, distributing the compound across an area approximately 15 meters in diameter. 4 buckets, 4 impact zones, potentially 4 separate fires. Fires that will spread, Comrade Major. That's the critical difference. A conventional ZAB-50 creates one fire that the Germans can isolate and extinguish. 4 spreading fires ignited simultaneously across different sections of the airfield would overwhelm their firefighting capacity. They would have to choose which fires to fight, and the ones they don't fight would consume everything in their path. Bershanskaya leaned back in her chair. The lamplight carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, emphasizing the toll that command had taken on her over the past months. She was 31 years old, Yelena knew, but in this light she could have been 50. Lieutenant Sorokin rejected this proposal. It wasn't a question. Of course, Bershanskaya knew. She knew everything that happened in her regiment. Yes, Comrade Major, he believes the concept is too dangerous and untested for operational deployment. And is it dangerous? Yelena considered lying. A confident denial might improve her chances. But something in Bershanskaya's gaze, something that demanded honesty, even when honesty was inconvenient, made the lie impossible. Yes, she said, there are risks. The compound is stable under normal conditions, but any incendiary material carries inherent hazards. A premature ignition during flight would be catastrophic. A failure of the release mechanism could leave burning buckets attached to the aircraft. A miscalculation in the mixture proportions could result in either insufficient combustion or uncontrolled detonation. You're not making a persuasive case, Comrade Kotova. I'm making an honest one, Comrade Major. Lieutenant Sorokin is correct that this proposal carries significant risks. What he failed to consider is that the current approach also carries significant risks that have already killed 16 of our comrades and show no sign of diminishing. Bershanskaya's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of her attention. Yelena pressed forward. The mathematics are straightforward. At current attrition rates, the regiment will lose operational effectiveness within 6 weeks. Every mission we fly against Voroshilovgrad using conventional tactics increases our exposure to their defenses without proportionally increasing our probability of success. We are trading lives for negligible gains. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. My proposal also carries risks, but it carries the possibility of a different outcome. The conventional approach offers only the certainty of continued losses. Silence settled over the command tent. Outside, Yelena could hear the distant sounds of the airfield, engines being tested, ground crews calling to each other, the particular rhythm of an organization preparing for another night of war. When Bershanskaya finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I have written 11 letters to families since we arrived at this sector. 11 letters explaining that their daughters, their sisters, their wives died bravely in service to the motherland. 11 letters that say nothing about the real truth, that they died because we sent them against targets we knew we couldn't destroy, using weapons we knew were inadequate, because those were the only weapons we had. She stood and walked to the tent's entrance, pulling back the canvas flap to look out at the darkening sky. I became a pilot because I believed I could make a difference. I accepted command of this regiment because I believed I could protect my women while still accomplishing our mission. I was wrong on both counts. She turned back to face Yelena. The Germans are winning the war of mathematics, Comrade Kotova. They have better aircraft, better defenses, better everything. The only advantage we possess is our willingness to try things that seem impossible. Then you'll authorize a test? Bershanskaya's laugh was short and bitter. If I authorize your test and it fails, if one of my pilots dies because I approved an experimental weapon system, against the advice of my chief engineer, I will be court-martialed, possibly shot. At minimum, I will spend the rest of my life knowing that I killed one of my own women through recklessness and desperation. Yelena felt her hope beginning to collapse. I understand, Comrade Major. I apologize for wasting your time. I didn't say no. The words hung in the air between them. I said I would be court-martialed if the test fails, Bershanskaya continued. I did not say I was unwilling to accept that risk. She walked back to the field table and picked up one of the reconnaissance photographs. The airfield at Voroshilovgrad is responsible for more Soviet deaths than any other single installation in this sector. Every day it remains operational, more of our soldiers die. Not just pilots, but infantry, tankers, artillery crews, everyone who depends on air superiority that we cannot provide. She set down the photograph and met Yelena's eyes. You will have one test, one mission. If your compound works as you describe, we will discuss broader implementation. If it fails, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Thank you, Comrade Major. I won't disappoint you. Don't thank me yet. There are conditions. Bershanskaya's voice hardened. First, you will not conduct this test alone. You will fly as navigator with an experienced pilot and someone who can bring the aircraft home if your contraption malfunctions. Second, you will prepare the compound and the delivery system yourself under my direct supervision. No one else in this regiment will be endangered by your chemistry experiments until we know they actually work. Third, and most importantly, you will tell no one about this arrangement, not your fellow mechanics, not Lieutenant Sorokin, no one. If word reaches Moscow that I authorized an unsanctioned weapons test, we will both face consequences that make death in combat look appealing. I understand, Comrade Major. Do you truly understand what you're asking me to do? Bershanskaya stepped closer, her voice dropping to an intensity that was almost physical. You're asking me to gamble with your life and the life of whoever flies with you. You're asking me to bet my career, my freedom, possibly my existence, on the intuition of a 22-year-old chemistry student who has never flown a combat mission. You're asking me to trust you. Yelena held her gaze without flinching. Yes, Comrade Major, that's exactly what I'm asking. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, Bershanskaya nodded. Report to the armory at Or 400 tomorrow. Bring your notebook. And Kotova? Yes, Comrade. Major, if you're wrong about this, if your calculations are off by even a small margin, I won't have time to write a letter to your family. There won't be enough left of you to identify. I understand. Good. Dismissed. Yelena saluted and turned to leave. She was almost through the tent flap when Bershanskaya's voice caught her one final time. The pilot I'm assigning to your test flight is Nadezhda Popova. She's the best we have. Don't get her killed. Outside, the night had fully arrived, the stars emerging one by one against the velvet darkness. Somewhere to the west, the Voroshilovgrad Airfield waited, its searchlights probing the sky, its Messerschmitts sleeping in their hardened shelters. Yelena walked toward the armory, her notebook clutched against her chest, her mind already racing through the preparations that lay ahead. She had 48 hours to turn theory into reality, 48 hours to prove that a farmer's daughter from Krasnodar could change the mathematics of war. The chemistry, she told herself, would have to be perfect. The mixture had the consistency of thick honey and smelled like a chemical plant had collided with a petroleum refinery. Yelena worked by lantern light, her hands protected by leather gloves that had already begun to show signs of deterioration from the compound's corrosive properties. 4 buckets stood in a row on the workbench, each one modified according to her specifications. The wire mesh reinforcement gleamed dully in the lamplight. The quick-release hooks, salvaged from parachute harnesses and adapted with copper wire, had been tested 17 times each. The release cable, routed through a series of pulleys that would connect to the navigator's position, lay coiled beside them like a sleeping serpent. You're certain about the proportions? Major Bershanskaya stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching Yelena work with the particular intensity of someone who had staked everything on a single throw of the dice. 3 parts ammonium nitrate to 1 part petroleum distillate, with saponified fat as a binding agent at approximately 15% by volume. Yelena didn't look up from her work. I've tested small samples. The burn temperature is consistent at 1100 to 1200 degrees Celsius. Duration averages 9 minutes per kilogram of compound. And the stability during flight? The compound requires friction or direct flame contact to ignite. Vibration alone won't trigger combustion. I've subjected samples to impacts equivalent to twice the expected stress during takeoff and landing. She paused, finally meeting Bershanskaya's eyes. It's as safe as I can make it, Comrade Major. but nothing involving incendiary materials is ever completely safe. Bershanskaya nodded slowly. Popova is waiting at Aircraft 7. She's been briefed on the mission parameters, but not on the nature of the payload. I thought it best that explanation come from you. She doesn't know about the buckets? She knows she's flying a test mission with experimental ordnance. She volunteered anyway. A ghost of a smile crossed Bershanskaya's face. Nadezhda has never been one to refuse a challenge, especially one that the men said couldn't be done. Yelena sealed the last bucket and began the careful process of loading them onto a handcart. The total weight was just under 60 kilograms, well within the PO2's payload capacity, but distributed differently than conventional ordnance. The balance would be slightly off. Popova would have to compensate during flight. Comrade Major, Yelena said, if this works, we discuss next steps tomorrow. If it doesn't work, there won't be a tomorrow to discuss. Bershanskaya stepped aside to let Yelena pass with the cart. Good hunting, Comrade Kotova, and try not to die. I've grown tired of writing letters. Nadezhda Popova was smaller than Yelena had expected. In the stories that circulated through the regiment, stories of impossible missions, miraculous escapes, bombing runs that defied both physics and probability, she had assumed a larger-than-life figure. The reality was a woman of perhaps 24 years, compact and precise, with eyes that seemed to calculate trajectories even when looking at something as mundane as a fuel gauge. So you're the chemistry student, Popova said, watching as Yelena supervised the attachment of the buckets to the aircraft's lower wings. The one who thinks she can burn down an airfield with farmers' tools. The physics is sound, Yelena replied, not rising to the implicit challenge in Popova's tone. The compound will perform as specified, and if it doesn't, then we'll have approximately 3 seconds to regret our career choices before the aircraft becomes a very large firework. Popova laughed, short, sharp sound that contained no humor, but a great deal of respect. I like you, Kotova. Most of the new girls try to pretend they're not terrified. You just calculate the probability of death and move on. Fear's inefficient. It doesn't change the mathematics. No, Popova agreed, climbing into the pilot's seat. It doesn't, but it makes the mathematics harder to accept. She began her pre-flight checks, hands moving across the controls with the unconscious grace of long practice. The target tonight is the fuel depot on the eastern edge of the airfield. It's separated from the main aircraft shelters by approximately 200 meters. Close enough that a fire could spread, far enough that the Germans might not prioritize its defense. I thought we were targeting the hangars directly. We were. But Bershanskaya and I discussed the tactical situation, and we agreed that a secondary target offers better odds for your test. If your compound works against the fuel depot, the resulting fire should be visible for kilometers. We'll know immediately whether the concept is viable. Yelena considered this as she climbed into the navigator's seat. The logic was sound. A fuel depot would provide the ideal conditions for demonstrating the compound's spreading properties. And if the fire grew large enough, it might reach the main aircraft shelters anyway, carried by wind and the sheer intensity of burning petroleum. The release mechanism is here, she said, showing Popova the cable assembly. One pull releases all 4 buckets simultaneously. We need to be at approximately 200 meters altitude and traveling at reduced airspeed, no more than 70 kilometers per hour, to ensure accurate distribution. 200 meters. That's within effective range of their light flak batteries. Yes. And if they illuminate us with searchlights at that altitude, we won't have time to evade. Also, yes. Popova was quiet for a moment, her hands resting on the control stick. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its sardonic edge. I've flown 412 missions, Kotova. I've been shot at, shot down, and shot through. I've watched friends die in burning aircraft, and I've killed more Germans than I can count. In all that time, I've never once flown a mission that I believed had less than a 50% chance of success. She turned to look at Yelena directly. What are our odds tonight? Honestly, Yelena met her gaze without flinching. If the compound performs as designed and the release mechanism functions correctly, I estimate our probability of success at approximately 60%. If either system fails, our probability of survival drops to less than 10%. 60%? Popova tested the word like she was tasting wine. That's better odds than most of the missions I flew last month. Let's go burn something. She signaled to the ground crew, and the engine coughed to life over enemy territory. 23:47 hours. The night was clear and cold, the stars providing just enough illumination to distinguish the dark ribbon of the Donets River from the darker masses of forest on either side. Yelena navigated by compass and stopwatch, counting seconds, calculating drift, making the constant small corrections that kept them on course toward a target she couldn't yet see. The Voroshilovgrad Airfield announced itself first by sound, the distant rumble of generators, the occasional bark of a vehicle engine, and then by light. Searchlights swept the sky in lazy arcs, not yet alerted to any specific threat, simply maintaining the routine vigilance of a well-defended installation. "I see the fuel depot," Popova said, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "Eastern perimeter, just where intelligence said it would be. 3 large storage tanks, maybe 4. Support buildings to the south." Yelena peered over Popova's shoulder, trying to make out the target through the darkness. The tanks were visible as darker shadows against the general gloom of the airfield. Cylindrical shapes that promised catastrophic secondary explosions if the compound did its work properly. "Begin an approach," Popova said. "Cutting engine in 30 seconds. The familiar routine of a Night Witch bombing run began to unfold. Popova throttled back, letting the aircraft's momentum carry them forward while the engine dropped to an idle that was barely distinguishable from silence. The wind over the canvas wings created that distinctive sound, the whisper of broomsticks that had given them their name. 20 seconds. The searchlights continued their lazy sweeps, oblivious. 15 seconds. Yelena's hand found the release cable, her fingers wrapping around the worn wooden handle. 10 seconds. The fuel depot resolved into clarity below them. 3 cylindrical tanks, a cluster of smaller support buildings, the geometric patterns of access roads and security fencing. 5 seconds. "Now," Popova whispered. Yelena pulled the cable. For a terrible instant, nothing happened. The resistance in the mechanism was greater than she had anticipated. The cold night air had stiffened the wire. The pulleys had developed friction she hadn't accounted for. She pulled harder, throwing her weight into the motion, and felt something give way. The aircraft lurched as 60 kilograms of payload suddenly departed. Yelena caught a glimpse of the buckets tumbling away into the darkness, separating from each other as they fell, spreading across the target area in a pattern that was almost exactly what she had calculated. Then the first bucket hit. The compound ignited on impact exactly as designed, but the reality of that ignition was something her calculations had not prepared her for. A blossom of orange flame erupted from the ground, spreading outward in a hungry wave that seemed to reach for the nearest structure like a living thing. Before that first fire had fully established itself, the second bucket struck, then the third, then the fourth. 4 points of origin, 4 spreading fires, and between them the fuel depot's storage tanks sat waiting like offerings to a hungry god. "Climb," Yelena shouted. "Climb now." Popova didn't need to be told twice. She slammed the throttle forward, pulling the aircraft's nose up, clawing for altitude with every ounce of power the elderly engine could provide. Behind them, the searchlights finally reacted, beams of white light stabbing upward, seeking the source of the attack. But they were too late and looking in the wrong direction. The first secondary explosion came as they cleared the airfield's perimeter. One of the fuel tanks had reached critical temperature, its contents igniting in a fireball that rose 50 meters into the sky. The shockwave buffeted the PO2, rattling the canvas, threatening to flip them into an uncontrollable spin. Popova fought the controls with silent intensity, her jaw clenched, her hands moving in the precise micro-corrections of a master pilot. The second tank went up before they had traveled another kilometer. Then, the third. Yelena turned in her seat to watch the Voroshilovgrad airfield burn. The individual fires had merged into a single conflagration that painted the horizon in shades of orange and red. The support buildings were already engulfed. The access roads had become rivers of flame. And somewhere in that inferno, she knew, the Germans were scrambling to save whatever they could, pulling aircraft from shelters, evacuating ammunition stores, fighting a losing battle against a fire that refused to be contained. It worked, Popova said. Her voice was strange, quiet, almost reverent. Your farmer's chemistry actually worked. Yelena didn't respond. She was still watching the fire, still counting the secondary explosions, still calculating the destruction she had unleashed. 60% probability of success she had estimated. She hadn't estimated how it would feel to be right. The sun rose over a changed landscape. Yelena stood at the edge of the flight line, a tin cup of weak tea cooling in her hands, watching the column of black smoke that still climbed from the western horizon. 12 hours after the attack, the Voroshilovgrad fuel depot continued to burn. The fire had spread beyond the initial target area, consuming support buildings, maintenance facilities, and, according to the reconnaissance reports that had begun filtering in overnight, at least 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s that had been parked too close to the conflagration, 3 aircraft, destroyed not by bombs but by fire that refused to be contained. The mathematics, it seemed, had finally shifted. You should be sleeping. Yelena turned to find Nadezhda Popova approaching across the muddy ground, her flight suit still bearing the soot stains from their mission. Neither of them had slept. Neither of them could. I tried, Yelena said. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fire spreading. I kept calculating the thermal propagation rates, trying to understand exactly how it worked. And did you understand it? Partially. The compound performed better than my projections. Approximately 30% more coverage area than I had calculated. I think the petroleum content in the storage tanks created a synergistic effect, amplifying the initial combustion. She paused, aware that she was slipping into the technical language that made most people's eyes glaze over. The short version is that we got lucky. The target was more flammable than I expected. Popova laughed softly. Lucky? We flew a wooden canvas aircraft loaded with experimental incendiaries into the heart of a defended German airfield, and you call it lucky. The compound could have failed to ignite. The release mechanism could have jammed. The fuel tanks might have been empty or protected by fire suppression systems. Any number of variables could have produced a different outcome. Yelena sipped her tea, grimacing at the bitter taste. We succeeded because the conditions were favorable. That's the definition of luck. You know what I think? Popova settled onto an ammunition crate beside her, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with practiced ease. I think you don't know how to accept a victory. You're so focused on what could have gone wrong that you can't see what went right. What went right is that we're still alive to analyze the mission. What went right is that we have data to improve the compound and the delivery system. What went right, Popova interrupted, is that you just proved every man who ever doubted us wrong. Sorokin said it was impossible. The tactical officers said night bombers couldn't destroy hardened targets. Moscow said women couldn't be trusted with combat aviation. She exhaled a stream of smoke toward the burning horizon. And now, there's a German airfield on fire because a chemistry student from Krasnodar refused to accept their limitations. Yelena was quiet for a long moment. The smoke column had begun to thin slightly, the fire finally exhausting the available fuel, but the destruction it had caused would take months to repair. Months during which those Messerschmitts wouldn't be hunting Soviet aircraft, months during which supply lines would be disrupted, maintenance schedules would be delayed, operational readiness would be compromised. It's not enough, she finally said. What? 1 airfield, 3 aircraft. It's not enough to change the war. We need to replicate this success. Multiple targets, multiple missions, consistent results. We need to prove that what happened last night wasn't an anomaly. Popova studied her for a long moment, the cigarette forgotten between her fingers. You're already thinking about the next mission. I'm thinking about the next 100 missions. The compound can be produced in larger quantities if we have access to the right materials. The delivery system can be refined to improve accuracy and reduce risk. With proper implementation, every PO2 in this regiment could carry the same payload we tested last night. And you want to be the one to make that happen. It wasn't a question. Popova had seen something in Yelena's eyes, the same hunger that had driven her to approach Sorokin, to petition Bershanskia to climb into an aircraft loaded with homemade incendiaries and fly toward almost certain death. I want to make sure we don't waste this opportunity, Yelena said carefully. What we did last night proves the concept works, but concepts don't win wars. Implementation wins wars, scaling wins wars, and right now, I'm the only person in this regiment who understands the chemistry well enough to scale this up. Before Popova could respond, a messenger appeared at the edge of the flight line, breathless from running. Comrade Kotova, Comrade Popova, Major Bershanskaya requests your presence in the command tent immediately. There's been a communication from front headquarters. Command tent, 0730 hours. The atmosphere in the command tent had changed since Yelena's last visit. The reconnaissance photographs of Voroshilovgrad still covered the field table, but now they were joined by new images, aerial shots taken just hours ago showing the devastation in stark black and white detail. The fuel depot was a blackened crater. The surrounding buildings were reduced to skeletal frameworks, and scattered across the eastern perimeter of the airfield, the burned-out hulks of aircraft lay like the carcasses of metal insects. Major Bershanskaya stood at the center of the tent, flanked by two officers Yelena didn't recognize. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the 4th Air Army's Tactical Planning Division, the people who decided which targets were worth dying for. Comrade Kotova, Comrade Popova. Bershanskaya's voice was formal, her expression carefully neutral. These officers have been dispatched from front headquarters to assess the results of last night's operation. The senior of the two officers, a major with a thin mustache and eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. I am Major Konstantin Volkov, Tactical Assessment Division. This is Lieutenant Yuri Petrov, my adjutant. He gestured toward the photographs on the table. We have reviewed the reconnaissance imagery and the preliminary damage reports. We have also spoken with Major Bershanskaya about the nature of the ordnance used in this attack. Yelena felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment she had feared. The bureaucratic machinery of the Soviet military grinding into motion, seeking to either claim credit for success or assign blame for unauthorized action. The ordnance was experimental, she said carefully, developed using materials available within the regiment's existing supply allocation. The deployment was authorized by Major Bershanskaya as a tactical test under field conditions. We are aware of the authorization chain, Volkov replied. His tone gave nothing away. What we are attempting to determine is whether this experimental ordnance can be replicated at scale. The destruction of the Voroshilovgrad fuel depot has created a significant gap in German logistics for this sector. If the same results can be achieved against other targets, it would represent a substantial force multiplication for night bomber operations. Force multiplication. The phrase hung in the air like a lifeline. They weren't here to assign blame. They were here to assess potential. The compound can be produced in larger quantities, Yelena said, her confidence growing. The base materials, ammonium nitrate, petroleum distillates, saponified fats, are all available through standard military supply channels. Production requires no specialized equipment beyond basic mixing containers and protective gear. A trained team of 4 personnel could produce enough compound for 20 sorties per day. Volkov exchanged a glance with his adjutant. And the delivery mechanism? Simple fabrication using available materials. The buckets are modified from standard issue containers. The release hooks are adapted from parachute harness components. The cable assemblies require basic metalworking skills, but no precision engineering. Yelena paused, then added, the entire system was designed specifically to be reproducible under field conditions. That was the point. The point, Volkov repeated slowly. And what exactly was the point, Comrade Kotova? To give night bomber regiments the capability to destroy dispersed targets, airfields, supply depots, ammunition stores, without requiring precision bombing accuracy or increased payload capacity, to turn our limitations into advantages. Volkov was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then slowly he nodded. "Major Bershanskia," he said, "I am authorizing immediate expansion of this program within your regiment. Comrade Kotova will be temporarily reassigned from maintenance duties to oversee production and training. Lieutenant Petrov will remain here to document the process for potential implementation across other night bomber units." He turned back to Yelena. "You will have 2 weeks to demonstrate consistent results. If successful, this program will be submitted for formal evaluation by the Technical Directorate." 2 weeks. 20 missions. The chance to prove that last night wasn't luck. It was the future. "Understood, Comrade Major," Yelena said. "We won't disappoint you." Production facility, former supply shed. 3 days later. The smell was the first thing everyone noticed. Yelena had converted a disused supply shed into a makeshift production facility, establishing an assembly line that could process the compound from raw materials to loaded buckets in under 4 hours. The work was dirty, dangerous, and demanding, but the women of the 588th had proven remarkably adaptable. "The key is consistency," Yelena explained to the latest group of trainees, demonstrating the mixing technique for what felt like the 100th time. The proportions must be exact. Too much ammonium nitrate in the compound becomes unstable. Too little and it won't generate sufficient heat. The petroleum distillate must be added slowly with constant stirring to ensure even distribution. Senior Sergeant Katya Budanova, one of the regiment's most experienced navigators, temporarily reassigned to production duty, watched the demonstration with focused attention. "And if we make a mistake, if the proportions are off, then you'll know immediately. The compound will either fail to ignite during testing or it will ignite prematurely during mixing." Yelena kept her voice matter of fact. "In the second case, you'll have approximately 2 seconds to evacuate the facility before everything within a 10-meter radius catches fire." Comforting. "I didn't design this to be comfortable. I designed it to work." The production line had already achieved a rhythm of efficiency that surprised even Yelena. In 3 days, they had manufactured enough compound to arm 16 aircraft, 4 sorties worth of the new incendiary payload. Tonight, the first operational deployment would take place, 4 Po-2s, each carrying 4 buckets, targeting a German supply depot near Stalino. If successful, it would more than double the proven effectiveness of the compound. If unsuccessful, it would prove that Voroshilovgrad had been exactly what Yelena feared, a statistical anomaly, a stroke of luck that could not be repeated. Lieutenant Sorokin appeared in the doorway of the shed, his expression a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed resentment. He had not spoken to Yelena since the morning after Voroshilovgrad, when the reconnaissance photographs had made denial impossible. Now, watching her instruct others in the techniques he had dismissed as idiotic, he seemed to be wrestling with something he couldn't quite articulate. "The number 4 aircraft has a fuel line issue," he said finally. "It will need to be replaced before tonight's mission. I'll have someone look at it within the hour. You could look at it yourself. You're still the best mechanic in this regiment." Yelena set down her mixing paddle and met his eyes. "I'm also the only person who understands this compound well enough to ensure it doesn't kill our pilots. The fuel line can wait. This can't." Sorokin's jaw tightened, but he nodded and withdrew without further comment. Behind Yelena, Katya let out a low whistle. "I've never seen anyone put Sorokin in his place like that. I didn't put him anywhere. I stated a fact." Yelena returned to her demonstration, but her hands were trembling slightly. The confrontation had cost her more than she wanted to admit. "Now, observe the stirring technique. Clockwise motion, consistent speed, 30 rotations per minute. Over enemy territory, Stalino sector. 2,215 hours. 4 aircraft, 16 buckets. 1 opportunity to prove that the chemistry of fire could be replicated at will." Yelena flew in the lead aircraft again, this time with a navigator named Vera Bellick, a quiet woman from Leningrad who had lost her entire family during the siege and now flew missions with the mechanical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. The 3 trailing aircraft maintained formation behind them. Each crew briefed extensively on the new tactics. Each aircraft loaded with the compound that Yelena had personally inspected before departure. The target was a German supply depot that intelligence had identified as a critical node in the Wehrmacht's logistics network for the southern sector. Unlike the Voroshilovgrad fuel depot, this facility contained ammunition, vehicle parts, food supplies, and communication equipment. A diverse array of materials that would test the compound's effectiveness against non-petroleum targets. Visual contact, Vera reported, her voice crackling through the primitive communication. Tubes that connected the 2 cockpits. Supply depot bearing 275, approximately 3 kilometers. Yelena peered through the darkness, making out the geometric patterns of storage buildings, access roads, and defensive positions. The Germans had learned from Voroshilovgrad. She could see additional searchlight emplacements, expanded anti-aircraft batteries, what appeared to be new firefighting equipment staged near the main storage areas. They were afraid now. Afraid of women in wooden aircraft who made fire fall from the sky like the wrath of ancient gods. Good. All aircraft begin approach sequence, she transmitted to the formation. Standard dispersal pattern. Each crew selects independent target within the facility perimeter. Release at 200 meters, then climb and egress south. Rendezvous point is the river crossing at grid reference 47. The 4 PO2 separated, each pilot guiding her aircraft toward a different section of the depot. The searchlights began their probing sweeps, but the dispersed approach made it impossible for the defenders to concentrate their attention on any single threat. Yelena's pilot, Sergeant Olga Sanfirova, a former agricultural pilot from the Volga region, cut the engine with practiced smoothness. The whisper of wind over canvas replaced the engine's drone. Below them, the depot sprawled in unsuspecting darkness. Release point in 10 seconds, Vera called out. Yelena's hand found the cable. She had tested this mechanism herself, verified the tension, confirmed the release pressure. It would work. It had to work. 5 seconds. The storage buildings resolved into clarity, long, low structures with corrugated metal roofs, the kind of construction that would channel heat and accelerate fire spread. Now, she pulled the cable. 4 buckets tumbled away into the darkness. A heartbeat later, the first impact bloom erupted. Orange fire spreading across the roof of a storage building, clinging to the metal, generating heat that would warp and buckle the structure within minutes. All around the depot, the other aircraft were releasing their payloads. 16 points of ignition blossoming in the night, 16 fires reaching for each other across the darkness. The first ammunition cook-off came 47 seconds after initial impact. A cascade of small explosions within one of the storage buildings that shattered windows, collapsed walls, and sent burning debris spiraling into adjacent structures. The second cook-off followed 12 seconds later, larger and more violent. By the time the 4 PO2s had cleared the area and begun their egress, the entire northern section of the supply depot was engulfed. The fires had merged into a single conflagration that cast dancing shadows across the Ukrainian steppe. All aircraft report, Yelena transmitted. Aircraft 2, payload delivered, no casualties. Aircraft 3, payload delivered, minor flak damage to starboard wing, no casualties. Aircraft 4, payload delivered, no casualties. 4 aircraft out, 4 aircraft returning, 16 buckets deployed, 1 supply depot burning. The mathematics had shifted. Again, 588th Night Bomber Regiment, forward Airfield. The following weeks, the successes multiplied with each passing mission. In the first week, the regiment struck 3 additional targets using the incendiary compound, a vehicle maintenance facility near Mariupol, a communication relay station outside Taganrog, and a field hospital supply cache that German forces had been using to support operations along the Meuse River. Each attack demonstrated the compound's effectiveness against different target types. Each attack refined the tactics and procedures that would maximize its impact. By the end of the second week, the statistics told a story that even the most skeptical observers could not ignore. 14 missions flown using the new ordnance, 11 confirmed target destructions. 23 German aircraft destroyed on the ground, more than the regiment had achieved in the previous 6 months combined. 4 fuel depots eliminated, creating a logistics crisis that forced the Germans to reroute supply convoys through exposed territory. 2 ammunition dumps detonated, their explosions visible from 30 kilometers away. And the losses? 2 aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire, both recovered safely, 0 casualties. The Germans, meanwhile, were developing what the intelligence reports described as acute psychological degradation among units stationed near potential target areas. The Night Witches had always been feared. Their silent approach, their relentless persistence, their seemingly supernatural ability to appear and disappear at will. But the new attacks were something different. The fires they created didn't behave like normal fires. They spread too fast, burned too hot, resisted all attempts at suppression. Rumors began circulating among German troops. The Soviet women had made a pact with dark forces. They were throwing hellfire from their aircraft. They were not human at all, but demons summoned from some Slavic underworld. The legend of the Nachthexen grew darker and more terrible with each passing night. Lieutenant Petrov, the adjutant from front headquarters, documented everything with meticulous attention. His reports, which Yelena was not permitted to read but which she knew were being transmitted to Moscow, contained detailed assessments of the compound's properties, the production procedures, and the tactical applications that had been developed. He interviewed pilots, navigators, and ground crew. He photographed the production facility, the modified aircraft, the loaded buckets waiting for deployment. He was building a case. Yelena understood that much. What she didn't understand was who the case was being built for, and whether she would be credited or erased when the final document reached its destination. Command. Tent. Night of the 17th mission. Major Bershanskaya called her in after the evening briefing when the other pilots and navigators had departed to prepare for the night's operations. The reconnaissance photographs on her table showed a new target, a German airfield near Melitopol that intelligence had identified as a staging area for fighters being transferred to the Crimean front. 12 aircraft, Bershanskaya said. That's what the photographs show. 12 Bf-109s parked in hardened shelters on the eastern perimeter of the field. Yelena studied the images. The shelters were substantial, concrete construction, blast-resistant doors, the kind of protection that conventional bombing could barely scratch. But they had weaknesses: ventilation systems, drainage channels, the narrow gaps where the doors didn't quite seal. We can reach them, she said slowly. The compound doesn't need to penetrate the shelters. It just needs to get close enough to heat them. Concrete conducts thermal energy. If we can raise the ambient temperature around those shelters high enough, the aircraft inside will cook. How high is high enough? Jet fuel ignites at approximately 210 degrees Celsius. The compound burns at 1200. Even with thermal dispersion and the insulating properties of concrete, we should be able to raise the interior temperature past critical threshold within 15 to 20 minutes of sustained burning. Bershanskaya nodded slowly. Lieutenant Petrov has requested to observe tonight's mission from the command post. He wants to see the operation from planning through execution. Is that a problem? It's an opportunity. Bershanskaya's eyes met hers with an intensity that Yelena had come to recognize as the Major's way of communicating important information without explicitly stating it. Everything that happens tonight will be documented and reported to Moscow. The technical directorate is preparing to make a decision about whether to adopt this program across all Night Bomber regiments. What they decide will depend largely on what Lieutenant Petrov writes in his final report. The implication was clear. This mission wasn't just about destroying 12 German aircraft. It was about demonstrating beyond any possible doubt that Yelena's innovation was worthy of recognition at the highest levels. I understand, Comrade Major. Do you? Because I want to be certain you understand what's at stake. Bershanskaya leaned forward, her voice dropping. If this mission succeeds, you will have accomplished something that no one believed possible. You will have changed the way night bomber operations are conducted across the entire Eastern Front. Your name will appear in reports that generals read. Your methods will be taught to pilots you'll never meet. And if it fails, then you'll be a footnote, a failed experiment. The woman who got lucky once at Voroshilovgrad and then couldn't replicate her success when it mattered. Bershanskaya's expression softened slightly. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, Yelena. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth. In war, there are moments that define everything that comes after. Tonight is one of those moments. Yelena looked at the photographs again, the concrete shelters, the parked aircraft, the geometric precision of German engineering that was about to meet the chaotic fury of fire. Then we'd better not fail, she said. Over Melitopol Airfield. 0037 hours. 6 aircraft this time, the largest deployment of the new ordnance yet attempted. 24 buckets of incendiary compound, distributed across the formation in a precise pattern designed to create overlapping fire zones around the hardened shelters. Yelena flew in the second wave, her aircraft loaded with a special modification she had developed specifically for this mission. Buckets with extended burn duration achieved by increasing the saponified fat content and adding a small quantity of powite calcium oxide that would react with atmospheric moisture to generate additional heat. The first wave struck at 035, their payloads impacting in a crescent pattern along the southern approach to the shelters. The fires that erupted were different from previous missions, slower to spread but more intense, creating walls of flame that heated the surrounding air to temperatures that made breathing difficult for anyone within 50 meters. Second wave, begin approach, came the transmission from the lead aircraft. Yelena's pilot, Sergeant Raisa Aronova, a mathematics teacher from Kiev who had discovered an unexpected talent for precision flying, cut the engine and began the silent glide that would carry them over the target zone. Below, chaos reigned. German ground crews were attempting to fight the fires from the first wave, but the compound's adhesive properties made suppression nearly impossible. Water evaporated on contact. Sand smothered the surface flames, but couldn't stop the deep burning. Every minute that passed raised the temperature inside the concrete shelters by another few degrees. Release point in 5 seconds, Yelena's navigator called out. She watched the shelters growing larger in her field of vision, massive gray structures that had been designed to withstand direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. They couldn't withstand this. Nothing could withstand this. Now, the buckets fell. The modified compound struck the ground beside the nearest shelter and erupted into fire so intense that Yelena felt the heat through the aircraft's canvas skin. The flames climbed the concrete walls, found the ventilation grates, poured inside like liquid seeking its own level. Within 30 seconds, the first shelter's blast doors blew outward as the fuel tanks of the aircraft inside reached ignition temperature. A moment later, the second shelter followed, then the third. By the time the 6 Po-2s had completed their attack, runs and begun their egress, 8 of the 12 hardened shelters were compromised. Inside them, German aircraft were cooking in their own fuel, their aluminum skins melting, their ammunition cooking off in cascades of secondary explosions. Yelena didn't turn to watch this time. She didn't need to. The mathematics had told her everything she needed to know. 588th Night Bomber Regiment, Forward Airfield. Dawn. Lieutenant Petrov was still writing when Yelena returned from the debrief. He sat in a corner of the command tent, his pen moving across page after page of official documentation, pausing only occasionally to consult his notes or examine one of the reconnaissance photographs that had arrived just before dawn. 12 German aircraft destroyed, 8 hardened shelters rendered unusable. A staging facility that had been preparing to reinforce the Crimean front was now a smoldering ruin. Comrade Kotova. She turned. Petrov had set down his pen and was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Lieutenant, I will be returning to front headquarters tomorrow to deliver my final report. He stood gathering his papers into a leather satchel. The technical directorate will make their decision within the week, but I wanted you to know, before I left, what that decision is likely to be. Yelena waited, not breathing. Your compound and delivery system will be adopted for use across all Night Bomber regiments operating on the Southern Front. Production specifications and training materials will be distributed within the month. The Tactical Directorate estimates that implementation will increase night bomber effectiveness by approximately 40%. 40%. The number seemed abstract, disconnected from the flames and explosions she had witnessed over the past weeks. But she understood what it meant. More targets destroyed, more German aircraft eliminated, more supplies denied to the enemy, more lives saved on the Soviet side, more lives ended on the German. Thank you, Lieutenant. Don't thank me. I simply documented what you created. He paused at the entrance to the tent, turning back for a final word. The report will credit the development to the collective efforts of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, operating under the leadership of Major Bershanskaya. Individual contributions will be noted in the classified technical appendix, which will be reviewed only by cleared personnel at the directorate level. Individual contributions, noted in a classified appendix, reviewed only by people with special clearance. The bureaucracy was already beginning to digest her innovation, to transform it from the desperate improvisation of a chemistry student into the systematic product of collective Soviet engineering. But tonight, at least, she knew the truth, and so did the women who had flown beside her, and so did the Germans who had watched their airfield burn. The war ended not with a thunderclap, but with a gradual dimming, like a fire burning down to embers. Yelena Vasilievna Kotova stood on the edge of a captured German airfield, watching the last operational mission of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment return from the darkness. 6 Po-2s descended through the pre-dawn haze, their engines coughing the familiar rhythm she had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat. One by one, they touched down on the scarred runway, their canvas wings catching the first pale light of what would become Victory Day. 60 kilometers. That was how close they had come to Berlin itself. 60 kilometers from the heart of the beast that had swallowed 27 million Soviet lives, that had burned villages and cities and entire civilizations in its hunger for conquest. 60 kilometers from the end of everything. Major Bershanskaya climbed out of the lead aircraft, her flight suit stained with oil and exhaustion, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who had just flown their final combat mission and wasn't quite sure how to feel about it. She saw Yelena watching from the edge of the runway and walked over, her boots squelching in the mud that seemed to cover everything in this corner of Germany. "It's finished," she said. The words came out flat, almost confused, as if she were testing a language she had forgotten how to speak. "The mission?" "The war." Bershanskaya pulled off her flight cap and ran her fingers through hair that had gone gray at the temples over the past 3 years. "Word came through while we were in the air. The German command has authorized surrender negotiations. It's finished, Yelena. We won. We won." The words should have meant something. They should have triggered celebration, relief, perhaps tears of joy or exhaustion. Instead, Yelena felt only a vast emptiness, the sudden absence of purpose that had defined every moment of her existence since that first night over Voroshilovgrad. 23 months. That was how long she had been producing the compound, refining the delivery systems, training new crews and techniques that had spread far beyond the 588th Regiment. The K-7 incendiary device, as the bureaucracy had officially designated her creation, was now standard equipment across 7 night bomber regiments. Intelligence estimates credited it with the destruction of over 200 German aircraft, 47 fuel depots, and countless supply installations. 200 aircraft, each one a pilot who would never fly again, ground crew who would never reload ammunition, mechanics who would never repair battle damage. Each one a small victory in a war measured in millions of deaths. And now it was over. "What happens now?" Yelena asked. Bershanskaya's laugh was short and bitter. "Now we go home, whatever that means anymore." She looked toward the eastern horizon where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The regiment will be disbanded within 6 months. The women will be demobilized, sent back to their families, expected to resume the lives they left behind in 1941, expected to forget, expected to become wives and mothers and factory workers and collective farmers, expected to stop being soldiers. Bershanskaya's voice hardened. Moscow has already made it clear that there will be no place for women in the peacetime Air Force. Our services were acceptable when the motherland was desperate. Now that the crisis has passed, we're supposed to return to our proper roles. Yelena thought about the women she had served with over the past 3 years. Nadezhda Popova, who had flown over 800 missions and been shot down multiple times, who had survived wounds that would have killed lesser pilots. Vera Bellick, who had lost her family in Leningrad and found a new one among the night bombers. Katya Budanova, who had mastered the production of incendiary compounds with the same precision she brought to navigation calculations. What would become of them? What would become of any of them? The victory parade, she said suddenly, in Moscow. Will the regiment participate? Bershanskaya's expression told her everything she needed to know before the major even spoke. We've been informed that our aircraft are too slow for the aerial component of the parade. The PO-2s would disrupt the formation of the modern fighters and bombers. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was carefully controlled. There will be a ground contingent of female veterans in the parade, representatives from the medical corps, the anti-aircraft batteries, the partisan units, but not pilots. Pilots require aircraft, and our aircraft are unsuitable. Unsuitable. The word hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire that had burned itself out. I see, Yelena said. Do you? Bershanskaya turned to face her directly, and in her eyes, Yelena saw something that might have been anger or might have been grief, perhaps both, intertwined so tightly they could no longer be distinguished. Do you understand what this means, Yelena? Not just for the regiment, but for everything we accomplished. The official history is being written right now in offices in Moscow by men who never flew a single mission over enemy territory. They're deciding what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. They're deciding who the heroes are. And we won't be among them. We'll be a footnote, a curiosity. The women who flew those funny little biplanes during the war before the real Air Force showed up to win the battles that mattered. Bershanskaya's voice cracked slightly. 23,000 sorties, 3,000 tons of bombs, 32 women dead, and we'll be a footnote. Yelena looked at her commanding officer, the woman who had believed in her when no one else would, who had risked everything on the intuition of a chemistry student with a notebook full of equations. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the pain she saw in Bershanskaya's eyes. But she had never been good at comfort. She had always been better at mathematics. The fires we started aren't footnotes, she said finally. The airfields we destroyed, the supply lines we cut, the German soldiers who couldn't sleep because they were afraid of the sound of broomsticks in the night. Those aren't footnotes. The official history can say whatever it wants. The people who were there know the truth. Bershanskaya was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Go get some sleep, Yelena. We have a long journey ahead of us. Krasnodar, Soviet Union, October 1945. The agricultural chemistry laboratory at Krasnodar State Institute smelled exactly as Yelena remembered. A mixture of fertilizer compounds, soil samples, and the particular mustiness of scientific journals that hadn't been opened in years. The war had interrupted her studies in 1941. Now, 4 years later, she was attempting to resume them as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent those years learning to make things burn instead of grow. Professor Mikhail Andreevich Sorokin, no relation to the lieutenant who had once mocked her ideas, was a kindly man in his 60s, who had spent the war years maintaining the Institute's research programs with a skeleton staff of students, too young or too essential to be conscripted. He had welcomed Yelena back with genuine warmth, asking no questions about her military service beyond the polite minimum. Your transcript shows excellent marks in organic chemistry and thermodynamics, he had said during their first meeting. With some additional coursework, you should be able to complete your degree within 18 months. 18 months. As if the gap in her education could be measured in calendar units, rather than in burning airfields and midnight bombing runs. She had accepted his assessment and enrolled in the required courses. She attended lectures, completed assignments, conducted laboratory exercises. She learned about crop rotation and soil pHing and the nitrogen cycle. the peaceful applications of the same chemical principles she had once used to create weapons of war. At night, she dreamed of fire, not nightmares exactly. The dreams were too precise for that, too orderly. She would find herself calculating burn rates and thermal propagation patterns, adjusting compound mixtures in her sleep, optimizing delivery mechanisms for targets that no longer existed. She would wake in the darkness of her small dormitory room, her hands clenched around phantom release cables, her nostrils filled with the phantom smell of incendiary paste. The other students avoided her. They were young, 17, 18, 19 years old, children who had spent the war in evacuation centers or factory schools, who knew of combat only through propaganda films and patriotic songs. To them, Yelena was a strange creature, a woman of 24 who spoke little, smiled less, and occasionally paused, in the middle of conversations as if listening for the sound of distant engines. She didn't blame them for their discomfort. She barely recognized herself anymore. The official demobilization had come in August, along with a document certifying her service and a small monetary allowance that was supposed to help her transition back to civilian life. The document listed her rank, junior sergeant, her unit, 588th Night Bomber Regiment, redesignated 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, and her role, armor and technical specialist. It made no mention of the compound she had developed, the mission she had flown, the airfield she had helped destroy. Those details existed only in classified files, locked away in archives that she would never be permitted to access. The K-7 incendiary device continued to appear in military technical manuals, of course. She had seen a reference to it in a journal article about night bombing tactics, cited as a product of systematic development by Soviet military engineers during the Great Patriotic War. The article made no mention of buckets, or chemistry students, or desperate women flying wooden aircraft against impossible odds. Systematic development, as if the compound had emerged fully formed from a military laboratory, created by anonymous professionals following standardized procedures, as if she had never existed at all. Krasnodar Agricultural Research Station, March 1947. Yelena completed her degree in the spring of 1947 and accepted a position at the Regional Agricultural Research Station, where her knowledge of chemistry could be applied to the development of improved fertilizers and pest control compounds. It was useful work, important work, the kind of work that helped feed a nation still recovering from the devastation of war. It was also work that allowed her to disappear. The research station was located 15 kilometers outside the city, in a cluster of low buildings surrounded by experimental crop fields. The staff was small, a dozen researchers, a handful of technicians, a rotating population of graduate students. And the pace was slow, methodical, focused on long-term projects that measured progress in growing seasons rather than combat sorties. Yelena found a strange peace in the routine. She rose early, walked to the laboratory, conducted experiments, recorded data, analyzed results. She ate her meals in the station's small cafeteria, exchanged pleasantries with colleagues whose names she sometimes forgot, returned to her quarters in the evening to read technical journals or listen to the radio. She did not speak of the war. No one asked. The other night witches had scattered across the Soviet Union, returning to homes and families and lives that had been put on hold for 3 years. Yelena received occasional letters from some of them, brief updates about marriages, children, new careers, but the correspondence gradually diminished as the years passed and the shared intensity of combat faded into memory. Nadezhda Popova had become a flight instructor, training a new generation of pilots who would never know what it felt like to glide silently over enemy territory. Vera Bellick had married a factory manager in Leningrad and was raising 2 children. Katya Budanova had died in a training accident in 1946, her aircraft suffering mechanical failure during a routine flight. A bitter irony for a woman who had survived hundreds of combat missions. Major Bershanskaya, she would always be Major in Yelena's mind, regardless of her post-war civilian status, had retired to Moscow, where she worked as an administrator for the State Aviation Authority. They exchanged letters occasionally, formal and carefully worded, avoiding any mention of the classified operations that had once bound them together. The silence grew comfortable. The memories grew distant. The woman who had once calculated trajectories of fire became a woman who calculated nitrogen absorption rates in winter wheat. And the years continued to pass. Krasnodar Agricultural Research Station, May 1968. 23 years after the war's end, Yelena Vasilievna Kotova was 47 years old, gray-haired, and largely forgotten. She had risen to become deputy director of the research station's soil chemistry division, a position that carried modest prestige and even more modest influence. She had never married. The opportunity had presented itself several times over the years, but she had always found reasons to decline. The men who courted her seemed to exist in a different world, a world where fire was something that cooked food and warmed homes, not something that fell from the sky and consumed everything it touched. She had made her peace with solitude. It was easier, she had decided, than trying to explain. The knock on her office door came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, when the spring planting was in full swing and the research station hummed with the quiet activity of another growing season. Yelena looked up from a report on potassium deficiency in cotton crops, expecting to see one of her technicians with a question about laboratory procedures. Instead, she saw a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel and a worn notebook that looked older than most of the students who occasionally visited the station. "Comrade Kotova?" The woman's voice was professionally pleasant, the tone of someone accustomed to interviewing reluctant subjects. "My name is Irina Nikolaevna Volkov. I'm a journalist with Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm writing an article about the women who served in combat aviation during the Great Patriotic War." Yelena felt something cold move through her chest. She had avoided journalists for 23 years, declining interview requests, refusing to attend reunion ceremonies, politely but firmly maintaining the silence that the authorities had implicitly demanded. "I'm afraid you've made a wasted trip," she said. "I was a technical specialist, not a pilot. My service was not particularly noteworthy." "That's not what Nadezhda Popova says." The name struck her like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken to Popova in over a decade, had assumed that their wartime connection had faded into the general blur of half-remembered history. "You've spoken with Nadezhda." "I've spoken with many of the surviving night witches." The journalist settled into the chair across from Yelena's desk without waiting to be invited, her manner suggesting that she was accustomed to pushing past initial resistance. "I'm writing a comprehensive history of the regiment, the real history, not the sanitized version that appears in official sources. The women I've interviewed have told me remarkable stories, but many of them mentioned your name specifically. They said that you developed something that changed everything." "I developed nothing. I was a mechanic and an armorer." "They said you created a compound that made their bombs more effective, that you flew missions yourself to test it, that you trained other women in techniques that spread across multiple regiments." The journalist opened her notebook, flipping to a page covered in handwritten notes. "Nadezhda Popova called you the woman who taught us to make fire fall from the sky. She said that without your innovation, the regiment would have been destroyed within months of arriving at the front." Yelena stared at the journalist, at her earnest expression in her worn notebook, and her obvious determination to uncover truths that had been buried for over 2 decades. "Why now?" she asked finally. "Why, after all these years, does anyone care about what we did?" "Because the official history's a lie. Because the women who served deserve to be remembered. Because young people today have no idea that their grandmothers flew combat missions, while their grandfathers were being celebrated as the sole heroes of the war." The journalist's voice carried a passion that seemed disproportionate to a simple newspaper article. "And because I believe that some lies are too big to remain unchallenged forever." Yelena was silent for a long moment. Outside her office window, she could see the experimental field stretching toward the horizon, neat rows of crops grown in soil that her research had helped optimize. It was a good life she had built, a quiet life, a life that asked nothing of her except competence and showed nothing to the world except an unremarkable woman doing unremarkable work. But it was also a life built on silence, and silence, she was beginning to understand, had its own weight. "What do you want to know?" she asked. The journalist's smile was small but genuine. "Everything. Start from the beginning." The interview. Yelena talked for 3 hours. She told the journalist about the recruitment poster in Krasnodar, about the training at Engels, about her decision to join the 588th as a mechanic rather than seeking a more prestigious assignment. She described the early missions, the mounting losses, the desperate mathematics of attrition that had threatened to destroy the regiment before it could accomplish anything meaningful. She explained the compound, the chemistry, the proportions, the delivery mechanism, in more detail than she had shared with anyone since the war. She described the night she had approached Sorokin, his contemptuous dismissal, the conversation with Vera Antonova that had given her the courage to seek a higher authority. She spoke about Major Bershanskia, about the gamble they had taken together, about the first test over Voroshilovgrad and the fires that had burned until dawn. She recounted the subsequent missions, Stalino, Mariupol, Taganrog, Melitopol, and the cascading successes that had proven her concept beyond any possible doubt. And she described the aftermath, the official adoption of the compound under a bureaucratic designation that erased her contribution, the classified technical reports that acknowledged her innovation but would never be seen by the public, the gradual dissolution of the regiment, the demobilization, the return to a civilian life that had no place for the skills she had developed. "The official records call it the K-7 incendiary device," she said finally, "developed by Soviet military engineers through systematic research and testing. There's no mention of buckets or chemistry students or women who mixed explosive compounds and converted storage sheds. The history they wrote is a history without us." The journalist had filled an entire notebook with her cramped handwriting. Now she looked up, her expression thoughtful. "But the women remember, the ones who flew with you, who used your compound, who survived because of what you created. They remember. Memory isn't history. Memory dies with the people who hold it. When the last of us is gone, there will be nothing left except the official records." Yelena heard the bitterness in her own voice and was surprised by its intensity. She had thought she had made her peace with anonymity. She had been wrong. "That's why I'm writing this article," the journalist said quietly. "Memory can become history if someone takes the time to record it. Your story, the real story, deserves to be told. And if the authorities object, if they decide that your article contradicts the official narrative, then I'll find another way to tell it. The truth has a way of surviving, Comrade Kotova. Sometimes it just needs a little help." Yelena looked at this woman, this stranger who had appeared in her office and asked her to break 2 decades of silence, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, exactly. Something more fragile than that. Something that might have been the first stirring of a wound beginning to heal. "There's one more thing you should know," she said, "about why I did it. Not the compound. That was just chemistry. But why I kept working, kept flying, kept pushing even when everyone told me it was impossible." "Why?" Yelena was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that had never been spoken aloud. "The first mission I flew, the test over Voroshilovgrad, I told myself I was doing it to prove the mathematics, to demonstrate that my calculations were correct. But that wasn't really true." She paused, remembering the feel of the release cable in her hand, the sight of fire spreading across the German airfield, the strange mixture of terror and exhilaration that had accompanied her through the night sky. "The truth is that I did it because I was angry. Angry at Sorokin for dismissing me, angry at the war for killing my friends, angry at a world that had decided women could only be nurses and factory workers and wives." She met the journalist's eyes. "I wanted to prove that I could do something that mattered, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away or attributed to someone else." "And did you?" Yelena thought about the airfield she had helped destroy, The aircraft that had burned, the German soldiers who had learned to fear the sound of broomsticks in the night. She thought about the women who had flown beside her, the compound that had spread to 7 regiments, the thousands of missions that had been made more effective by her innovation. "I thought I did," she said finally. "Now I'm not sure it matters. The war's over. The enemies are gone, and the only people who remember what I did are other forgotten women who will die before the century ends." The journalist closed her notebook and stood. "Maybe that's true," she said. "Maybe memory does die with the people who hold it. But maybe, just maybe, that's why stories need to be written down, so that memory can become something more permanent, something that outlasts the people who lived it." She extended her hand, and Yelena shook it. "Thank you for your time, Comrade Kotova. Your story will be told, I promise you that." Krasnodar Agricultural Research Station 3 weeks later. The article appeared in Komsomolskaya Pravda on a Sunday morning in June, buried in the back pages of the weekend edition where controversial content could be published without attracting too much official attention. Yelena read it alone in her quarters, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. The journalist had kept her promise. The story was there. Not all of it, not the classified technical details that could still cause problems, but the essence of what had happened. The desperate situation facing the 588th, the young chemistry student with an unconventional idea, the officer who had taken a chance, the fires that had changed the mathematics of night bombing. Her name appeared 3 times in the article, 3 small mentions in a piece that was mostly about the regiment as a whole, about the collective achievements of the night witches, rather than the individual contributions of any single woman. But it was there. Her name was there in print in a newspaper that would be read by thousands of people across the Soviet Union. She was no longer completely invisible. A week later, a letter arrived at the research station. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, cramped and precise, unchanged in the 20 years since Yelena had last seen it. She opened the letter with trembling fingers. "Dear Yelena Vasilievna," I read the article. "I should have written this letter years ago, but I was never good with words, only with numbers and machines and the practical things that kept our aircraft flying. I want you to know that I was wrong. In 1943, when you came to me with your notebook and your diagrams, I called your idea idiotic. I dismissed you as an amateur, a chemistry student playing at weapons design. I was arrogant and foolish, and I nearly cost us the innovation that saved the regiment. I have thought about that moment many times over the years. I have wondered what would have happened if you had listened to me, if you had accepted my dismissal and returned to your maintenance duties, and never approached Major Bershanskaya with your proposal. The regiment would have continued losing aircraft and crews until there was nothing left. The mathematics were clear even then. We were dying, and I couldn't see the solution because it came from someone I had decided couldn't possibly know anything worth knowing. You proved me wrong. You proved all of us wrong, and I never thanked you for it. Thank you, Yelena, for your stubbornness, your brilliance, and your courage, for saving lives that would have been lost without you, for being right when I was certain you were wrong. With respect and admiration, Mikhail Nikolaevich Sorokin, former lieutenant, 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Yelena read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer of her desk where she kept her most precious possessions, and went back to work. Some validations came with medals and parades and official recognition. Others came in handwritten letters from men who had finally learned to see what they had once refused to acknowledge. Both kinds, she decided, had their own weight. Both kinds mattered. The grave was simple, a small headstone in the city cemetery, surrounded by others like it, marking the final resting place of ordinary citizens who had lived ordinary lives. Yelena Vasilievna Kotova, 1921-1991, chemist, teacher, daughter of the motherland. An elderly woman stood before the grave, leaning on a cane, her white hair stirring in the autumn wind. She had traveled from Moscow for the funeral, despite her age, despite the chaos that was consuming the Soviet Union in its final days. Nadezhda Popova had flown 852 combat missions during the Great Patriotic War. She had been shot down multiple times, wounded twice, and awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. She was one of the most decorated female pilots in history, her name recorded in books and museums and official histories. But standing before this simple grave, she thought only of a young woman with a notebook full of equations, explaining how fire could be made to spread. You never wanted recognition, she said quietly. You always said the mathematics was enough, that the results spoke for themselves. The wind carried her words away, scattering them across the cemetery like the ashes of forgotten fires. But I wanted you to know, I needed you to know, that we remembered, all of us who flew with your fire, who survived because of what you created, who lived to see our children and grandchildren grow up in a country that you helped defend. We remembered, Yelena. Every mission, every burning airfield, every night when your chemistry kept us alive. She placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the headstone, red roses, the color of flame. The official history forgot you, the bureaucrats erased you, the men who write the textbooks never learned your name. She paused, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to track down her weathered cheeks. But history isn't written only by officials and bureaucrats. It's also written by the people who were there, by the women who flew beside you, who mixed your compound in converted storage sheds, who watched German airfields burn because a chemistry student from Krasnodar refused to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. She touched the headstone gently, her fingers tracing the carved letters of Yelena's name. Rest now, my friend. Your fire burns in all of us who remember, and we will carry it forward as long as we live, as long as there is anyone left to tell the story of what you did. She turned and walked away, her cane tapping against the cemetery path, her shadow stretching long in the autumn afternoon light. Behind her, the flowers stirred in the wind, red petals bright against gray stone, the color of fire against the color of ash, the color of memory against the color of forgetting.